From the beginning of time, humans have had this need to survive. The earliest humans hunted and gathered their food. Now, we go to grocery stores. How do we get from point A to point B? Experts say this revolution in the way we live took place around 10,000 years ago, in the year 8000 BC. Get your pad and paper, because this is a pretty important advancement in history. Historians like to divide history into nice digestible chunks of years. The Old Stone Age began around 2 million years ago and lasted till about 8000 BCE. In order to survive, the earliest humans hunted and gathered their food. The New Stone Age officially began when people learned how to farm and produce their own food. Now that they didn't have to hunt and gather their food, early humans could remain in one location and build a civilization. They chose the most fertile areas where the crops could grow. As population grew, so did their civilization, culture, and the need for interactions with other civilizations. Once people discovered they didn't need to depend on hunting and gathering, they began to live very different lives. Early farmers learned what seeds would produce the most crops. They also learned how to domesticate animals. The Neolithic Age began when they invented farming. Finally, humans had a stable food supply. Thanks to agriculture and this surplus of food, humans could stay in one place. The earliest shelters were built with the natural resources that were in the area, like mud bricks, stones, and branches. Eventually, shelters became more complex with places to store food and pits for cooking. Most importantly, houses gave people protection from harsh weather and wild animals. These permanent shelters also allowed people to form larger communities. Also, thanks to agriculture, communities grew larger and larger. The surplus of food led these larger populations to create specialization in labor. Now, community members could divide up the work and become experts in a specific area. People had more time and energy for other activities. People had free time to invent new things and make their lives easier. Also, thanks to agriculture, people had new jobs. Previously, humans spent their days hunting and gathering. Now, because food was in surplus, people specialized their work in other areas. There were weavers, basket makers, tool makers, and traders. Focusing on one job allowed people to get better at their work. This led to new and better ways of doing things. Thanks to agriculture and a specialized workforce, people began trading with other civilizations. People began venturing out of their civilizations in order to get more resources they didn't have. Traders often traveled hundreds of miles to find what they wanted. Some popular items that were traded were flint, obsidian, and various beauty products. Trade not only brought new resources to different regions, but it also helped spread ideas and knowledge around the world. We've come a long way from being hunter and gatherers. A revolution has occurred. Humans figured out how to farm and make their lives easier. They created permanent shelters, communities, new jobs, and trade. Eventually, these smaller settlements would become much larger civilizations.
So what exactly are the world's biggest problems? Well, first and foremost, poverty is an inescapable issue for nearly all developing countries. Roughly 1 in 7 people around the world live on less than $1.25 a day, and nearly half of the global population lives on just $2.50. While about a third of the world's poor are located in India, only 10 countries house 80% of the poorest people on Earth. Closely tied to poverty is the issue of hunger. Inadequate nutrition contributes to nearly half of all child deaths worldwide. And in regions like sub-Saharan Africa, 1 in 4 people are malnourished. As a result, nearly 800 million people don't have access to enough food to live healthy, active lives. Similarly, water and sanitation are absolute necessities. Yet nearly the same number of people without access to food lack access to water. And a third of the world's population risks disease by not having adequate sanitation. Another major issue for developing countries is a lack of educational opportunities. The UN predicted in 2011 that if all students had even basic reading skills, world poverty could be reduced by more than 10%. But illiteracy is an asymmetrical problem and affects considerably more women than men. Of roughly 780 million illiterate adults worldwide, 2/3 are female. As a result, women have considerably fewer opportunities, and it hurts a country's ability to progress economically without a fully educated workforce. This inequality is rampant and not exclusively relegated to gender. Economic inequality is also drawn along racial and social divides. Countries like Namibia see only a few thousand white landowners owning almost half of the country's agricultural land for a population of more than 2 million. In fact, land distribution has become an increasingly relevant issue. With man-made climate change, deforestation, and overfishing, the rapid environmental decline might be too late to reverse. Although organizations like the UN have implemented standards and worked to save forests, oceans, and the atmosphere, it continues to be a serious issue for the international community. The UN Summit's 17 global goals span from micro to macro and hope to contribute to solutions for the world's biggest problems. Through communication, training, and financial support, it's up to influential world leaders and average citizens to seek to improve the world.
Hey guys, it's me Parley Patel and you're watching 400 Years. And in this episode, we're talking about migration. Now, obviously, migration is the movement of people. In fact, although we assume that migration only happened after the British came to India, it's been happening for hundreds of years before that. So we're focusing on migration to and from India after the East India Company established itself in India. And now I'm going to get Edward Anderson from the University of Cambridge to explain more.
It's important to remember that migration is not a new phenomenon whatsoever. People have been moving around the world for, well, as long as humans have been on the world, they've been moving around the world. There's economic factors, of course. There are political factors, for instance, conflict or war. It's more than just one diaspora. We can trace Indian migration to Britain for at least 400 years, in line with the history of the East India Company's first forays into India in the beginning of the 17th century, and then obviously going right up till the present day. Lascars or sailors were recruited in quite large numbers to work on particularly merchant navy vessels. During this period, although they were prohibited from settling in Britain, many actually ended up doing so, living in different parts of the UK, in particular London and other docks around the country. They might start families, there might be economic reasons why they wouldn't return. A lot of people were moving from areas which were hit by drought or famine or food shortages.
So in the 19th and 20th century, Indians started to move in the masses. But where did they go and what did they do? Let's see what Ed has to say.
the beginning of the 20th century, Indians began to settle in East Africa in quite large numbers, and particularly people were coming to trade and to set up businesses, to set up shops and so on. And under the indenture system, people were recruited for contracted periods, usually of around 5 years, and they travelled to work in various parts of the British Empire, from as far as Fiji to places like Mauritius, and also the Seychelles was an important place, also the Caribbean too. There was payment involved, but they were bonded, so there was limitations on freedom, and one had to work for the period that one had signed up to work for. And in many senses it wasn't really a step up from slavery, and this is actually why it's been referred to subsequently by Hugh Tinker as a new system of slavery.
So, in the early 1900s, Indians began to move everywhere around the world and settle into colonies and began working. And this is probably the reason why so many of our grandparents are from countries like Fiji, Mauritius, Guyana, and even Trinidad. So while this was going on, World War I began to kick off, and Indians played a huge role in assisting the British armies.
The Indian involvement in World War I and World War II was huge, and it's only really recently that we've started to recognise that more publicly. About 140,000 or so served on the Western Front. Often they would come to Britain, particularly those that were injured would come over to Britain to hospitals to recover. In the period following the Second World War is traditionally considered to be the beginning of this period of mass migration. One of the moments that's often seen as this start of this period is the arrival of the Empire Windrush, and they were welcomed to Britain, according to the headlines of the time, Children of Empire. So they were still part of the British Empire. The headline in the Evening Standard actually read, "Welcome home," at that point in time. So it's interesting to see how things have changed remarkably since then in terms of the tabloid way of reporting on migrants to this country.
So, by the mid-20th century, communities from the Caribbean and the South Asian subcontinent started arriving in the masses to Britain. But why were they coming there? Well, firstly, there were loads of reasons, and some of these were job opportunities, better lifestyles, and Britain had just formed its NHS.
There were various employment opportunities. The NHS had just been started, which was also an important factor for attracting migrant workers from overseas. And actually you can trace, where those employment opportunities were in terms of where we have large migrant populations in the UK. Northern mill towns and the industrial centres of the Midlands as well during this period. Tens of thousands of Asians in East Africa moved to Britain, and this was a period in which these countries were gaining their own independence. Over a very short period, the numbers are quite substantial. Under varying degrees of coercion, Asian populations were pushed out of Africa during this period. And of course, the most famous instance of that was Idi Amin's brutal expulsion of Asians in 1972, in which people were given just 90 days to leave and almost all assets were seized. And this was a particularly important moment in the history of Asian communities in Britain. There was a lot of concern in the UK over this category and over how to deal with that category, and very quickly quotas were brought in and laws were changed which actually obstructed entry. Britain was really turning its back on many notions of imperial or Commonwealth subjecthood. Many people felt that this undid the kind of ideas of what it means to be part of the British Empire that the British had been promoting for many, many years. And these were all efforts to try to restrict migration. During this period, we had criteria brought in terms of skills and language requirements, educational levels, and so on.
So in response to this huge influx of migrants coming to the UK, the government of Britain introduced acts and laws that made it increasingly difficult for people to come to the UK and settle down. So I've definitely heard stories from my grandparents and family members authors about migrating from East Africa to the UK. But what exactly was their story?